Welcome to the fourth part of the series of presentations on Helicobacter pylori. In this part of the presentations, we'll look at the epidemiology of Helicobacter pylori infection. So, as you can see from the map here, pylori is a relatively common pathogen, and on average it's estimated that up to 50% of the world's population have been infected. Many of these infected people live completely asymptomatically and they have no disease at all associated with the presence of the pathogen. In fact, there is some debate about whether in those individuals there is any benefit to eradicating the pathogen, and there's some growing body of evidence which indicates that eradication of the pathogen in asymptomatic patients may in fact be harmful. So as you see from the map of the world here, you can see that the pathogen is present with much higher prevalence in developing and third world countries relative to the levels in developed countries. And so obviously if you look in parts of West Africa, parts of South America, the prevalence is much higher there than it is in developed nations. If you look at North America, Europe, you see that the rate is significantly lower. And then if you go to island nations like the United Kingdom or Australia, you can again see that the prevalence is much lower, and so the prevalence is much higher in developing countries, and the other major trend we'll look at in a moment is that prevalence increases with age. So there's our first point. Let's move on to the second point, that prevalence increases with age. So as you get older, you're more likely to acquire the infection. So, for example, greater than 50% of 50-year-olds are believed to be infected. We also see a higher incidence in immigrants, and in immigrants from Latin America, the rate can be as high as or higher than 60%. And in immigrants from Eastern Europe, the rate can be greater than 50%. So as you look at this graph here, you can see there are two trend lines, developing countries in red and developing countries, or developed countries, in blue. And if you're having some color issues, then the blue line is the dotted line. So on the y-axis we've got prevalence, and then on the x-axis we've got age. And so what we're seeing here is how prevalence changes as a function of age. And you can see that in the developing countries, the infections occur much earlier in life and much more rapidly early in life than they do in developed countries. But the general trend in both sets of populations, developing and developed, is that prevalence increases with age. There have been a number of studies that have shown there's no correlation between tobacco and alcohol consumption and infection with pylori. People always want to look at those two variables being coincidence with an infection. In terms of factors which affect the infection rate, we see there's an elevated risk of infection when nutrition is poor, when it's inadequate, and in particular a diet rich in fruits, vegetables, and specifically, as you might expect, vitamin C is somewhat protective against infection. Then food preparation conditions are a major factor in determining infection rate, and food that is prepared under less than ideal conditions or close to contaminated soil or contaminated water significantly increases the risk of infection, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a moment. So generally, overall, poor sanitation, low social class, crowded living conditions all increase the incidence of infection. So that is our second and third points regarding the epidemiology of pylori. If we take a bit of a snapshot look at infection in the United States, and just to give you fair warning, this is, I think, one of my favorite graphs describing the epidemiology of infection and disease. So please make sure you can interpret Venn diagrams and that you understand what this diagram means. So let's take the green square. That is all of the people in the United States. So that's just the sum of the population. And the green part of the square, or the rectangle, I guess, sorry, indicates the proportion of the population which is Helicobacter pylori negative, and that's about 70% of the area here. Just to give you an idea, and that correlates with the first map I showed you. And the large purple circle, the biggest circle of them all, indicates those that have infections with pylori. And you can see that, as I mentioned just now, there's a good fraction, probably close to half to two-thirds, or certainly over half of the population have asymptomatic infections. And so a burning question is, should we even try and treat those people? Should we try and eradicate the pathogen? What is the frequency of conversion of asymptomatic disease, of asymptomatic situations into disease situations? Then if we look at these smaller circles, we can see that the one on the right, and I will try to trace this, but I can't make any promises given that I'm using a mouse, so I'm talking about this circle here. When we look at this circle here, this is showing the fraction of people that are Helicobacter pylori positive and negative that have duodenal ulcers. And you can see that the large proportion of people who have duodenal ulcers have pylori infections, and there is obviously a small fraction over here, this fraction that is outside the HB positive bubble, who have some other cause of duodenal ulcers. And then you can do the similar kind of analysis down with the gastric ulcer bubble, but it gets a little bit more interesting here. We've got several different areas that we can look at. So if we just call this area here 1, in area 1, those are people that have Helicobacter pylori, and they have both a duodenal ulcer and a gastric ulcer. So there is 100% correlation between the presence of pylori and the presence of both a duodenal ulcer and a gastric ulcer. That is very strong evidence that pylori is causative for these diseases. Obviously, that's different from correlation, but there is so much evidence at this point that that we accept the hypothesis that pylori is causative for some of these diseases. If we look in this area here, and let's call this area 2, those are people who have a gastric ulcer and are pylori positive. And then let's look at area 3 here, and I'm not going to do this for every single bubble, so don't worry, it's not going to get heinously boring. Those are people who have gastric ulcers that are being caused by something other than pylori infections. So as I mentioned in a previous presentation, that could be irritation due to aspirin or aspirin-like medications. And so you can do similar analyses yourself for looking at the gastric cancer bubble here. Obviously this is rarer than the ulcers. And then gastric lymphoma, remember that's our MALT B-cell lymphoma. Make sure you can do the analysis that I just described. Let's move on to point 5 and talk briefly about how the pathogen is transmitted from individual to individual. The two main routes here are oral to oral, so that is vomitus to vomitus, oral fluids being passed from individual to individual, and fecal oral. And the fecal oral route is particularly important in developing nations where there may be food preparation close to raw human sewage being spent into the environment. So those are the two main routes, oral and fecal oral. There are reports of contaminated well water being a source of transmission, fecal material from cats and houseflies, but obviously cats and houseflies probably not a major transmission route. Is what we're really kind of interested in, is reducing the oral and fecal oral routes. And obviously the fecal oral route is relatively easy to deal with just by making sure that people are well equipped to separate their food preparation areas from their general living quarters and where they defecate. So that's epidemiology of pylori, and the next thing we'll talk about will be treatment.